We're going to honor the Richard Holbrooke Lifetime Achievement Award winner. And here to do that, Andrew Krivak, the author of two novels, The Signal Flame and The Sojourn, which was a National Book Award finalist and received the 2012 Dayton Literary Peace Prize for fiction and the inaugural Chautauqua Prize. He earned an MFA from Columbia University, and he lives in Somerville, Massachusetts, with his wife and 3 children. Many of you Daytonians have known Andrew for many years. He may be the most sincere and genuinely kind-hearted person you'll ever meet here. He came to Dayton with his 3 beautiful children, and it's such a pleasure to welcome him back. Andrew will introduce this year's winner of the Richard Holbrooke Lifetime Achievement Award, Colm Tóibín. Andrew, come on up.
Thank you, everyone. I want to thank Sharon Rabin, the prize committee, for inviting me back to Dayton to be a part of this event. It's always just such a pleasure, and it's lovely to see those of you I know and have met, and to say hello. It's nice to see you again. And to you writers here for the first time, I hope that you now know you have a new home. It is a tradition for the presenter of the Richard C. Holbrooke Award for Distinguished Achievement to say a few words about Mr. Holbrooke, the man who brought men at war to Dayton, Ohio for an agreement to end a war. And I want to honor that tradition tonight. But I must say I feel as though I'm at something of a disadvantage. I never met Mr. Holbrooke. I'm not from Ohio. I'm neither a statesman nor a member of any service, foreign or military. What I know of Richard Holbrooke comes from what I've read about the man, what I've heard others say he was like, and my own interest in those parts of the world in which he was engaged in the service of diplomacy. It was no surprise to me then to have found that he was a man who thinks in narratives. He worked toward peace in the Balkans in 1994 as a writer would work to steer his or her characters to the conclusion of a story. Yet he also knew that narratives come in arcs. As long as we have thought in stories ourselves, we know that no good narrative comes without a conflict. What the ancient Greeks called the agon, the struggle, which is at the heart of every tragedy, epic journey, love story, and coming of age. While the resolution of the struggle may be the story's ultimate purpose, the tension that plays out within the arc is no less purposeful. Writers, readers, and I would venture good diplomats will tell you the key to any narrative is that terrifying moment when we must accept the truth that we don't know how it's going to end. In my Catholic boyhood in rural Pennsylvania, I was taught to think about the kingdom of heaven as a thing already and not yet. There are moments of fullness here, yet we know there's a need to work towards something more. I can't help but think that the spirit of Richard Holbrooke hopes we will not despair this evening while we are gathered to recognize achievements of peace. Many struggle still in countries around the globe, as well as in our own country, on our streets, in our workplaces, and in our homes for something yet resembling peace. And I'm glad that Susan mentioned that there is, yes, a city in Texas tonight where they are struggling with this very thing as we speak. But it should be more than a consolation that those who struggle to find peace in their lives are borne along by narratives like these we celebrate tonight, because these are the narratives in and through which we live and love and work and wait. We always have, and as long as stories are told, we always will. The first book I ever read by Colm Tóibín was The Sign of the Cross, his travelogue through Catholic Europe. It was 1996, and I was a Jesuit scholastic living and studying in Bratislava. My mother, Irene, whom I feel as though many of you know already, sent me the book just out in paperback. His chapter on the Velvet Revolution hit home about Slovakia, she wrote. So much faith after so much struggle. What are you seeing? Irene lived well the already and the not yet of her faith, hence her attraction to the Irish writer who begins the sign of the cross in his native Enniscorthy and who returns there in the shadow of Vinegar Hill after having explored not just the faith of others, but the struggle of his own, a struggle for which Irene had great respect. For my part, it was the way in which this Irish native son could write that kept the book in my backpack. In Bratislava, I might have walked past any one of the characters on the sign of the cross, but the question it raised in me was how I might find in my own struggle a narrative voice. When I returned home, I got my hands on what novels I could, which were then The South and The Heather Blazing, and so began my admiration for Colm Tóibín, which would span the next 21 years. To read Colm Tóibín is to understand the intimacy of struggle, his sense of home and the precision with which he depicts the quotidian, the daily actions of characters, the habitation not just of mind, but of the very limbs of those characters, is a quality of a writer at the height of his creative power. Do not, however, mistake this quality for passivity or quiet. Ordinary comes from the word ordinal, an ordered counting down of movement toward an end that is not an end. And it is there, on the stage of family, town, and nation, as well as in the deepest recesses of the heart, where lives struggle, where lives change. And in the house of Tóibín, there are many mentions. A writer good at revealing the struggles concealed in the depths of fictional characters has written too of his own struggle to understand what he has called the tension between the fearless imagination and the fearful self of the gay writer, men and women who live with strategies of concealment and revelation, because not just the norms, but the laws of nations and the prejudice of institutions have made this necessarily a part of their creative process. With magnanimity as well as a critical voice, Colm Tóibín reminds us that private struggles are no less purposeful because the struggle is not acceptable to some. The struggle in silence does not mute the struggle of life. In lands real and imagined, families whole and broken, characters homebound and exiled, lovers generous and forbidden, Colm Tóibín's hold is unfailingly on struggle and the tensions it illuminates. For in the ordinariness and complexity, intimacy and longing of every struggle, there we recognize our own. Listen to the woman whose son is dying of AIDS. I'd love if some of the happiness could be there in his spirit when he goes, as well as all the suffering. To the exile returned, home was some graves where my dead lay, outside the town of Enniscorthy, just off the Dublin road. To ancient memories from the house of Atreus, in time, what had happened would haunt no one and belong to no one, once they themselves had passed on into darkness and into the abiding shadows. To Mary, the mother of Jesus, if you want witnesses, then I am one, and I can tell you now, when you say that he redeemed the world, I will say it was not worth it. And to the words of a religious sister of St. John, of God, standing by the sea in Ireland in the fog. It is the others who have already found their peace. We walk among them sometimes, the ones who have left us. They are filled with something none of us knows yet. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me this evening to introduce to you the 2017 winner of the Richard C. Holbrooke Award for Distinguished Achievement in Literature, Mr. Colm Tóibín.
Thank you. Thank you. I have to lower the microphone a bit too. A few years ago, there was a party like this. There was a lot of Chardonnay. It often lifts the spirit, and someone came up to me and said, I never heard of you before, but I'm going to read all your books. And I wanted to say to her, no, please don't do that. If you just read one or two, one and a half, or, just start one, or one short story or something, but all that struggle, even when you were talking about some of them, no, just one or two would be enough, because, that's why I sort of looking around, I'm really grateful for this, and I feel really honored, but I'm a bit worried in case some of the judges might have read more than one or two, and that struggle that goes on in the books that I put so much into might have permanently darkened their minds, and I would worry about that. In the old days when we watched Westerns, we would sit up straight, even in Ireland, and feel excited in that moment in the movie when the figure appears behind a boulder on the hill and narrows his eyes as the wagons and horses below make their journey westward through new and unmapped territory. We know now that there will be action. The white man and woman moving slowly with their language and their need to make fences, they will have reason and technology on their side. The Native American will have an aboriginal relationship with the landscape and will have a language that the microphone can barely pick up. And once the territory has been mapped by the white man, the Native American language will live on, mainly in the names of some places. Its grammar will not grace the marketplace. Since it has no reason to spread, then it will slowly fade. And so it begins, the colonial drama. As we watch this scene, if we are Irish or Catalan or Croatian or Serb, it feels like something whose contours and emotions we fully recognize. It is easy then to remember moments from the places where two languages have collided, or when one folded uneasily over another. It is easy to conjure up those gnarled landscapes of possession and dispossession in all their disturbed imagery. If later, in a moment around the campfire, one of the Native Americans were to sing a song about love, in the language which they all share, there will be silence. They will think at first of love, and then maybe of lost love, and then maybe they will begin to contemplate other things they have lost or might come soon to lose, which the notes of the song seem to suggest more precisely than any list they could make. Some sense of themselves, who they are, where they belong. This sense, the emotion involved, will be more pressing and powerful than maps, laws, fences, borders. For the white people on their way to victory, this idea of having a precise place in which you belong will be taken for granted now. It will not need to be felt because it is not being threatened. It will seem natural, almost God-given. For others, however, it will mutate into terms with many meanings, which will come to haunt the second half of the 19th and much of the 20th and indeed the 21st century. Terms such as nationalism, terms such as identity. Take this one, for example. It was Tallinn in Estonia in 1994, and the Russians had finally left. And I was having supper with an Estonian family who were so relieved at what had happened and so full of hope for their country. They wanted now to connect with Scandinavia. They wanted to join the European Union. They saw Russia as an old, dark place that was not progressive. They saw the Russian language as something that had been foisted on them. They didn't want to hear it again. They wanted to hear their own language, and maybe Swedish and Finnish, but more than anything, English. The fact that there was just 1.5 million of them seemed only to add to their optimism, increase their happiness at the thought that they might finally be left in peace. They felt pride in themselves and who they were and what they might become. The only difficulty, or the only difficult moment during that supper that evening in Tallinn came when my host described the large Russian population of Estonia, who had suddenly found themselves in a country whose official language they did not speak. They still believe they are in Russia, my host told me. Soon, they said, these Russians, they would have to learn Estonian or just go home, even though many of them had actually been born in Estonia. I could feel my host's idealism, their understanding of this as an imperative, something which must happen in a small, fragile country. if its entire identity was not to be lost. But I was uneasy. The idea of inclusion, the understanding that diversity and impurity have rights too, and the tolerance of others who do not fully share a nation's identity was also an imperative, would take time to seep into the body politic of Estonia. This idea of a nation being created or imagined from deep roots in the past and fragile ones in the present was something that anyone Irish is acutely conscious of. The songs written by the members of a group called Young Ireland in the years around 1848 inspired a new national feeling. When boyhood's fire was in my blood, I read of ancient freemen of Greece and Rome who bravely stood 300 men and 3 men. And yet I prayed I yet might see our fetters rent in twain, for Ireland long a province be, a nation once again. And such songs would foment a national spirit which would help eventually to lead to the independence of the south of Ireland in 1922 and its becoming a republic in 1948. But in these small countries of ours, which have known that complex set of emotions about identity and loss of identity, nothing is simple. In Ireland, in the very years when a national spirit was being created, the English language was moving slowly into a dominant position. No one has ever fully explained why Ireland did not become bilingual, why the Irish language began to actually disappear. It seems history is to blame, as the Englishman says in James Joyce's Ulysses. I come from a place where identity has been entwined with and sometimes choked by religion. During the war in the former Yugoslavia, the war whose end was negotiated here in Dayton with Richard Holbrooke, after whom this prize is called, as one of the main architects of the agreement, I travelled through Croatia and Herzegovina. I saw buildings burn. The house where I stayed had sheds in the backyard filled with arms that would be used eventually to attack the Muslim population of Mostar. In Zagreb and in Medjugorje, I attended Mass with the translator, since I wanted to hear the sermons. What was surprising was that even though this was during the war, there were never prayers for peace, as there always were in Ireland, in both Catholic and Protestant churches during our troubles. Eventually, when I asked a priest in Herzegovina about this, he shrugged. And when I persisted, asking him if he had reached out to the churches on the other side in the war, he became almost angry, referring to the Orthodox faith as a dime store religion. I realized then that it was going to take a great deal of time for this war to end and for the wounds that it opened to heal. Or take the following moment. In 1986, as the troubles in Northern Ireland were really at their height, I went to the home of Alan Black in Bessbrook in County Armagh in Northern Ireland. He was a Northern Irish Protestant and I was a Southern Irish Catholic. A decade earlier, when he was coming home from work with 11 of his workmates, the van was stopped by what they had thought at first was the British Army. 10 of them were Protestants like him, but one was a Catholic who was told to identify himself and step aside. And then, in one of the worst sectarian attacks in the history of Northern Ireland, the 11 Protestants were shot. 10 of them died. Alan Black survived. We sat in his front room and watched a documentary that had been made about these killings. And then we started to talk about politics, about the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which had been signed the year before by the British and Irish governments, which gave the Irish government a say in the running of Northern Ireland. Like most Protestants in Northern Ireland, however, Alan was against the agreement. He did not believe that the Dublin government had any right to be involved in the governance of Northern Ireland. I was interested in what he had to say. Up to then, I had believed that such opposition was just irrational, something which arose from pure bigotry as much as anything else. And up to then, I have to admit, I had only once or twice sat in the home of a Northern Protestant on such easy and familiar terms. The partition of Ireland had kept us two men apart. I listened carefully as Alan Black turned to me and said that as a Protestant, he was against all forms of arbitrary authority, not only in religious but in civil affairs. That was the basis of his citizenship. And that was, he implied, why people like him in Northern Ireland did not want a united Ireland. They saw the Republic of Ireland as a Catholic state, and they saw Catholicism as a form of arbitrary authority. And now the Anglo-Irish Agreement was allowing a government for which he could not vote, which was not accountable to him, have some power in his country. He thought this was wrong. What was strange was that I had never heard this argument before, but I was not sure about it. The Anglo-Irish Agreement had for the first time recognised the allegiances of Northern Irish Catholics as being valid, as later agreements in Northern Ireland would accept the possibility of dual allegiances. In places where there are competing questions and arguments over nations, identities, allegiances, and borders, nothing is ever simple. It is often easier to be puzzled than sure, to say both as much as and or. As one of the characters says in Brian Friel's play translations, confusion is not an ignoble condition. And then there's the question of Catalonia in the news now. On the 27th of April, 1988, I went to the holy mountain of Montserrat, north of Barcelona, for the feast day of the Virgin. Later, when the ceremonies were over, I decided to walk back down the mountain. Soon I was offered a lift by an elderly couple. They were both from Madrid and spoke in Spanish. They had come especially for the feast of the Virgin, they said, but they did not want to stay any longer. They did not like what they saw. The mountain was beautiful and they had enjoyed the journey. The problem was the language. They couldn't understand a word of the Mass, not a word of the sermon. They were in Catalan, not in Spanish. And they were in their own country, they both explained. To make matters worse, the wife had tried to buy some holy pictures with prayers printed on them, but they had them only in Catalan, and she'd left without buying anything. Was everything like that now, they asked me. It was, I said. There was a television station in Catalan, many radio stations, 2 newspapers, signs in shops, lessons in schools, lectures in the university, all in Catalan. In Barcelona, I said that street names were in Catalan only. The husband said that he was first in Barcelona in 1939, and it was a great city. He had never imagined this could happen, he said, in his own country. Why do they want to have everything in Catalan, they asked. The wife, didn't understand why they couldn't just use Catalan among themselves. But surely for big occasions, like the feast day of Montserrat, they could just use Spanish, which was a language everyone understood. And so the argument goes on to this day. And often the argument we have in these complex nations of ours about identity deal with silence, deal with things which mustn't be said, which can't be said. So 2 years ago, when we had a referendum on the subject of gay marriage in Ireland, something which mattered a lot to me personally, we were given great instructions from on high within the gay movement, which was, could you guys just be silent for 3 weeks during this campaign? We don't want to hear from gay people. Could gay people just go really quiet and just look hurt? But if you're going to, a lot of campaigning in Irish elections is door to door. You just knock on someone's door and you say, "Would you vote for my party?" But don't do it. Go with your mother. Go with your sister. Go with your granny. If you get your granny out, get your granny to go with you and say, "This is my grandson, and he's gay, and we really love him. And we were at his sister's wedding last year, and we'd love to go to his wedding next year. And I know you don't agree with gay stuff, but if you could just lend us your vote, then that would be okay." Almost suggesting we might give it back next year. And so the campaign became about inclusion. Families began to talk about how much they loved all of their children, including their gay daughter, including their gay son, including their gay uncle. And the word love became the word inclusion, the word family, things that mattered in Ireland to everybody in any case. And then the former president of Ireland, Mary McAleese, intervened towards the end of the campaign. She'd been president for 14 years, a devout Catholic. I mean, so she's holier than the Pope, Mary, sometimes, or holier than Pope Benedict, anyway. She said, "Well, I have twins, and Justin is gay, but the other one isn't. So what am I to tell them? That I can go to one of their weddings and not the other? And if they ask me why, what will I say to them? Can anyone help me with this? And so in using implication, in appealing to people's better natures, in not getting involved in arguments or heated discussion, in attempting to enter people's spirit, the referendum was won 65 to 35, and it was a great day for the country. This business of what we want in the world, however, remains complex and is not always rational, even if it can be made to seem so at times. We live in a country, the Republic of Ireland, where 35% voted no. They are our neighbours, our friends, sometimes our family, and they are part of our country, and we have to include them also. Identity comes from something deep and strange, and the idea of language, in all its complexity, lives at the mysterious core of what it is to be alive in the world. As Caliban in Shakespeare had occasion to say to Prospero in his famous cry in The Tempest, "You taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. The red plague rid you for learning me your language." This relationship between Caliban and Prospero has many forms throughout history, most of them protean and unstable, filled with ironies and strange twists. The idea, for example, of the small country or the nation remaining peaceful under some pressures and becoming assertive under others was something that Richard Holbrooke was deeply alert to. The idea then, as I said, that nothing is simple within this world, filled with constitutional compromises, remaining grievances, conflicting loyalties, competing identities, racial tension, irrational hatred, uneasy allegiances, uncertain borders, borders that are built too well, and unpredictable outcomes can be used to explain what is happening now in England, Scotland, Catalonia, Kurdistan, to name just 4 places, and perhaps also here in the United States. But it might also be true to say that this idea of identity under pressure, in one form or another, has been present in history since time began. In its own way, it represents a secret history of the world we have inherited. It is unlikely to go away. In this context, people with the vision of Richard Holbrooke will always be needed, and we should honour their achievement and their memory. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.